Hello again, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. We are very excited to be talking to you today in light of our upcoming event, Legislative Education and Advocacy Day, where we're going to be talking to legislators all throughout the General Assembly about our bill, House Bill 445. Many of you are familiar with that bill, but if you're not, Joanna's going to be jumping in here in a minute and presenting everything you need to know about that, as well as just general legislative advocacy day and just advocacy in general, tips on how to be in touch with your legislators and much, much more. So we're very excited to have you. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Joanna now. My name is Tyler. I work here at NASW-PA as well as the Communications and Outreach Specialist. So we will be monitoring the chat box on the control panel here for this webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them and we will answer them as best we can. So we hope you enjoy, and I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Joanna now.
All right, thank you. Okay, I'm going to get the webcam started so that you can see me. Hello, everyone. All right, as Tyler said, I'm going to be talking to you about legislative advocacy and kind of the best practices and tips and tricks for leading change at the local, state, and federal level. This is helpful if you're planning on attending our upcoming Legislative Education and Advocacy Day, but we're going to approach it from a broader perspective so that we can so that it's something that you can use, whether you're working with your local government or whether you're doing advocacy all the way at the federal level. Okay. All right, so legislation and advocacy is very important for us as social workers and as the social work profession. It's tied into our code of ethics and our values, where our section 6.04, if you've read that recently, talks about how that we should expand equal access, eliminate or oppose discrimination and oppression, protect people who are vulnerable, embrace diversity, and expand choice, and that we should be aware of the legislative and the political arena on our practice and how it's making a difference. And that is really huge. The legislation and policy impacts everything we do, and it connects to our profession. And how do we get to practice social work? Do we have the ability that we need? Do we have the funding that we need? Do we, are we operating under a straitjacket that restricts us from doing what we need to do, or do we have the freedom to practice social work, to the best of our abilities? It impacts everything connected to our communities and our clients as well. So, so there's this huge impact of the legislative arena on everything connected to social work and to life in general. So, so it's important that we know how to use this tool effectively, and that we are able to pull it out and recognize when it's the most effective tool to help our clients and our profession. And as I said, it connects all through the core values of our profession, through service and social justice in particular, and human relationships. Certainly our integrity and our competence are protected, when our profession is operating under the best regulations. And even the dignity and worth of the person, if people are being treated unequally under the law, then it makes it more difficult to uphold that true value of the dignity and worth of the person. Here's a quick quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president, and that the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. As you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was one who had several social workers under his administration, including Francis Perkins and Harry Hopkins. Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor and was the creator behind many of our social policies, such as the 5-day work week and child labor laws, and even things like Social Security and Medicare are the brainchilds of our social workers who were in office during that administration. So I would say that social justice and social change and advancing core legislation is part of our heritage and certainly part of our profession moving forward. So everything we do we can do with social change and legislative advocacy, it all connects throughout all the different levels of government, including our local, our cities, townships, boroughs, etc. And with our mayoral races. And that's one area where it's really easy for social workers to get involved, including in all the way up to running for office. I personally know of at least a couple of social workers here in Pennsylvania who are running for their local boroughs or a local school board. And so that's a really good way for social workers to get involved. At the state level, we have our General Assembly, and of course the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch, and then all the way up into the federal level, where more and more people are starting to get involved and take action on national important issues. We work at all three levels of the three branches of government, including the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. You'll see this slide, which you do have the handout available to you, I believe, to download through the presentation. So you should be able to access this material. So this slide has it broken down for you between like the legislative, executive, and judicial, and how that looks at each of the different levels, local, state, and federal, and how those things intersect. But also to say that, social work advocacy has a role in each of those pieces. We're not solely interested in getting involved with the legislature any more than we're solely interested in being involved with the executive, but we follow where our efforts and our advocacy are going to be most effective. Sometimes you can get something done at one level that you can't get done with the other, and since our three branches are more or less equal in power, you can accomplish some things that you can't accomplish other ways. A great example of that is I worked with a different state that was working on an issue related to adoption, and the state was banning adoption for gays and lesbians. And because the legislature, every year there would be a bill filed to eliminate this proposal, but it would just sit there and nothing would ever happen with it. The most that ever happened was that there was one legislative hearing, but the bill still was not passed out of committee. However, the judicial branch took it up and heard a case and found it to be unconstitutional, and according to the constitution of that state. And then the executive branch, with a relatively friendly governor at the time, chose to not pursue it any further. So, so the change was able to be made without ever passing a law, only using the other branches of government. So we always have to be aware of what our best efforts are and be willing to use them. Another current example is that we're looking at changing the regulations in Pennsylvania related to school social work and creating a school social work certification. And at least at the moment, we're pursuing that through the executive branch because we may be able to do it through the Department of Education without passing a law. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy making process, and that is the acronym FLI, for formulation, legislative process, implementation, and evaluation, and all of those are important. The formulation process is just looking at, well, what's the problem and how do we solve what the problem is? And that can come from a variety of different perspectives. I think sometimes, being outside of the legislative process, we might think of this, creating a law or creating, a new policy as a foreign thing. But it doesn't necessarily have to be like that. It's anything that we can identify that's a problem that needs to be solved. And social workers out in the field are some of the best people to identify that sort of problem. One example that I can tell you is a different state that I'm familiar with. There was one social worker who identified a problem in their hospital where there were people who needed a healthcare proxy, but they had run through the entire list, of friends, family, acquaintances, etc. And there was nobody available to serve as a healthcare proxy for that individual. And so they had the idea that social workers could be a good replacement. In case that there was nobody else available to serve, that the hospital social worker would be able to do so. And so they brought that to, NASW's attention. Another one would be, to bring it to the attention of their legislator. And, a bill was, and then a bill was passed. So, these can come from very small things. And then the next thing is that it goes through the legislative process, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And then there's also additional information on the other two pieces. So the first part is moving the legislation, which can be a challenge. And here's where I'll take the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about the bill that NASW is working on. NASW is currently working on House Bill 445, which would do two things. One, it would officially add diagnosis to the scope of practice for clinical social workers, and two, it would add practice protection for social workers in regards to that you would not be able to open up a private practice without having the education and the licensure in order to back up that that you're qualified to do that. And both of those things are really important and are basically just bringing Pennsylvania up to what's generally national standards. 48 states out of 50, it's only us and Montana that don't have the practice protection piece. And that's important because other folks in other states who lost their license for whatever reason would be able to come in and open up a practice in Pennsylvania without consequence because a license is not required. And that's a really big consumer protection issue. And then the other piece is the diagnosis chunk, which just would make sure that we're on a level playing field with the rest of the country. 45 out of the 50 states have that, and we're one of only 5 states that don't have the sorry, I'm having like a blank moment. All right, that don't have the diagnosis piece. There we go. All right, so that's the bill, and so it's one good way to walk through the legislative process really quick is to kind of tell you the history of what's happened with that. And last session it was House Bill 1415. This session it's House Bill 445. And listed there, it can go through. It can start in the House or the Senate. In other states, it's a lot more short term than it is in Pennsylvania. Most states only have like a 2 or 3 month session, while Pennsylvania has a 2-year full-time session. So this process looks a lot different here than it does in other states. And so because we have that 2-year session, they like to take things a little bit more linearly. So it will go kind of like this diagram here, where it just goes from one place to the other, without any cross or, activity going on both sides. In places where they have a 2-month session, it's very compact and things kind of intermesh and cross with each other. But here, you might file a bill in both houses, but it tends to get picked up one place, move through the whole process, and then go to the other house and move through the whole process there. And one good example of how that works is that, it's not like you might think where, you get filed and then you get in line and everybody gets their chance. No, most bills that get filed never go anywhere. And that's definitely something to watch out for if you're looking at legislation and, is it moving? Are things actually happening with it? Or how do we get a bill to start moving when it's, when it otherwise hasn't been? So I kind of tend to imagine it as if you had an auditorium full of people, and and the person on stage gets to select a few members out of the audience, but every time every person wants to raise their hand. So how do you pick? How do you know which ones to go through? And sometimes the obvious answer there is that sometimes it's the loudest. That old squeaky wheel gets the grease metaphor. How do we make ourselves stand out? And that includes having phone calls and emails and legislative visits. Other times it can be because of relationships. If I'm the person on the stage and my friend tells me that, hey, the person in the second to the front row is really the best one for the job, then I might pick that one. And other times they just set some filters to try and limit what they're hearing when they're trying to make the selections. But that gives the committee chairs a lot of power because they get to decide what bills come before their committee. And we had some of that with House Bill 1415, where we had a committee chair a few years ago who didn't want to hear a bill unless it was unopposed. And we did at the time have some opposition from the psychiatrist. That has since been resolved, and so we are currently unopposed. And then it went through the rest of the process, all the way up until the Senate, where politics got in the way and it didn't pass at the last minute. Right now, House Bill 445 is the new bill for this session. Once the new session starts, the whole thing starts over again. And you go through, and we've already been through the Committee on Professional Licensure and the general the full House of Representatives, as you may have seen over the past few days if you got one of our emails announcing that it passed the House. So now we're going to the Senate. Advocacy Day is going to be the first day of that. And what we want to do is keep our bill as clean as possible. We don't really want any amendments, because if it's an amendment, guess what? It has to go back to the House, and that's not what we're looking for at this point. Does anybody have any questions about the bill? If you do, just type them into the message box, or if you have questions at any point, and Tyler is monitoring and will let us know if you have any questions. All right, without seeing anything, I'm just going to move on. So the implementation piece, implementation is, where after a bill passed, it then has to go through a sometimes long process, sometimes complicated process to actually go into effect. And that happens at every level too. One of the things right now, it was about 3 or 4 years ago now that BSW licensure was passed, and yet we still don't have BSW licensure. The reason for that is because it's still in the process of having regulations written, which are now finally out in the public. And so they are saying that this is going to be in place by 2018. However, it's interesting to see how long it takes to go into effect. Another example would be the child welfare laws that were passed a few years ago. The ones that make you, if you're a licensed social worker, you've had to take that child abuse training probably a couple of times now. That law, when it was passed, and increased all of the mandated reporters, um, and the non-mandated reporters too, the permissive reporters, they also, they severely increased the number of calls received by the office, but they did not increase the number of people doing intake. And so therefore they had quite a few calls that were going unanswered at the time. And that was, very interesting because so many people have so many calls have gone unanswered. All right, I did see a question pop up.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question from Karen. How many delegates voted for the bill and how many against?
Okay, fantastic. All right, for House Bill 445 in the House of Representatives, it was 183 votes for and 13 against. And the ones who voted against, we're still wanting, when we attend LEAD, we're still wanting to target them and, find out if there's anything that we can do to get them on our side. And then the ones who voted for the bill, we just want to say thank you and to hope that we can count on their support in the future. Okay. All right, so that was the examples of the implementation. Obviously, that that passing a law and then not having the support in place behind it, that that is problematic, and so that's why we want to make sure that implementation is strong.
Joanne, I'll also jump in for a second again. We have another question. I'm assuming in regards to the bill, what are you most concerned about these days, and what is still inspiring you?
Very, very good question. Thank you. What am I most concerned about these days? At the state level, I continue to be concerned about, making sure that we as the social work profession are strong. And I think that there's a lot of different ways of doing that. I think that, I think that we need to have a lot, and we need to be involved in social justice issues as well. I know personally, and this is very like me speaking as Joanna, not me speaking as the executive director of NASW per se, but I am definitely concerned about conversion therapy and the fact that that's still on the books, and I would rather, and prison related issues. I was privileged to hear the Secretary of the Department of Corrections recently, and there's a whole lot of there is a whole lot of change, and research that has shown of things that we could be doing to help reintegrate people from prisons back into society that doesn't just create more prisons. And that is, and so after hearing from him, I think that there's a huge role that social work can have in in those changes and those shifts. And of course, there's the issues that we struggle with as a whole country, like the opioid epidemic and the changes potentially to the healthcare system, trying to make sure that people have access to affordable care. I'm always inspired by, this is kind of a different answer, but I'm always inspired by whenever we have our legislative advocacy day, or whenever we have one of those call-in campaigns, and social workers are passionate folks, and so I love talking with social workers and hearing from them about what inspires them, and then that typically inspires me as well.
One more here too. For those who
Sure.
voted nay, Are there concerns we should know about when we visit the state senators?
We don't believe so at this point. There's usually only a handful, there's only a handful of people who voted no on House Bill 445. And most of them, there's a crew of folks who are just anti-regulation as a whole. And then there's probably a few others who just may not have been happy with our bill sponsor at the moment, for political reasons. But the really good news on that is that, you know, we talk about opposition, but there's certainly different levels of opposition. There's the kind of opposition, where you're actively working against a bill, or where you, even when it comes up before the House, where you get up and you testify against it, you try to persuade others to share your view. The kind of opposition that we had on this, while of course we'd rather have their support, this was the kind of opposition, the best kind of opposition to hope for, which is the kind that just, does not fight our bill, does not go against it in any way, just very quietly, when you get to the voting, they just push the no button. And we can respect that. Sometimes you can't take sometimes when you're doing advocacy, sometimes you're not going to get them all the way to yes, but if you can lessen your opponent's opposition, maybe to the point where they're not going to work actively against you, then you've still done a great job when it comes to advocacy. Okay. Any other questions at this point?
Doesn't look like we have any other right now.
Okay. All right. Fine. Thank you. Okay, so then the last piece of the whole FLI acronym about formulation, legislation, implementation, and evaluation is the evaluation piece, and that's just where usually bills aren't perfect, and so especially if you're making major change, you need to be aware of okay, what could we fix, what could we do better, and then maybe you go back and you start that process over again with a few tweaks to your former legislation. So in general, it would not be, we would be remiss if we never talked about politics while we're talking about, legislation and advocacy. But we're not going to go into depth in it, but just to say that it is a part of what we do, because of course, when you're meeting with your elected officials, it helps if your elected officials are the folks who share the same values and priorities that you do. And that's not necessarily a partisan thing. We have, we have Democrats who agree, who disagree with us on stuff or agree with us on stuff, and we have Republicans who do the same. So, it's really a bipartisan type issue. But, knowing that, knowing what social work stands for, and how do we have the ability to make an impact? Are we going to connect with our elected officials, and the long-term effects that, sometimes, when one party or the other gets together, they have very, they have priorities that may push things in ways that are, that are not the ways that we want to go. So, if we can help balance that out, then it's good. That speaks directly to the quote from Senator Debbie Stabenow, who is an MSW. And that is that it is easier to spend a few months and some money electing the right people than to spend years and a lot of money trying to get the wrong people to do the right thing. So we do encourage you to be involved in politics. And of course, at the very least to vote. And I love this cartoon, where we didn't vote because it won't make a difference. But of course, their group is larger than the ones who did. So social workers are, when you get to the question of, well, of course, social workers are involved. It's in our code of ethics, and we're passionate folks who care about legislative issues. But the fact of the matter is that that's not necessarily true. We're about as active as the teachers and the the doctors and the nurses and other groups and the lawyers and other groups that you hear about on TV. So we are very active, but we're not any more so than any of those other groups. And at least 1/3 of social workers are not politically active at all. Typically, I find when I give these kind of presentations that I'm usually speaking to the choir and preaching to the choir, and that you guys are probably the folks who are active. But in case you're, on this presentation in order to see about getting your feet wet for the first time, we'll give you the tools either way. So there's some research that was done to talk about, why social workers get involved and how social workers get involved, and kind of trying to see what the statistics about that were. So this is one study that was done in 2008 that evaluated different demographic characteristics and different variables about social workers, and said, well, who is more likely to be involved and who is not. Some of the interesting ones, as far as the folks who statistically were more likely to be involved, one was political interest, of course. The folks who are interested in it are more likely to be involved in it, which makes sense. Living in cities was one that I've never completely understood why that was a variable. And another one was NASW membership, which is sort of a commercial for us, but in other ways, I also think we give you the tools to be involved. So certainly it helps to get email alerts telling you, about the different things that are happening at the state legislature. But the one thing that was not significant that is an interesting variable is that across the board, what you hear when you talk to folks about why they're not involved is that they say they don't have enough time to be involved. But they research that, and whether people had a ton of free time or whether they pretty much were scheduled down to the minute, they were equally likely to be active in political advocacy. And it just goes to show that the values and the priorities of where you put it is really more significant than than anything else. There was another study that looked at some why people were more or less likely to be involved. The internal barriers that people identified, which is part of the reason why we have LEAD and other legislative advocacy training events. One is because social workers feel that they lack competency, like they lack the skills, or that they don't have sufficient education in macro skills. And one thing that I'll say there is that a lot of what you need to be an effective advocate are the same skills that you need in order to, to practice at the clinical level. So I don't, even though, I think that there is, something to be said for strong macro practice education. I mean, that was my area of focus, and I appreciated it. There's not as quite of a barrier as people see. We, if you have the skills to work with clients, you're already working with people who have different backgrounds, different educations, different cultures, perhaps, different ages, different populations. So you're already working in that spectrum, to be able to connect directly with people who are different from you. And that is definitely something that you need to be an effective advocate. If you have, if you've worked on your interviewing skills or your skills with establishing rapport with your clients, then those are the same things that you can use to, to build a rapport with your elected official. It's just sort of that philosophy of thinking of your legislator or other elected official as sort of, as sort of a client. In the same way that you work with clients to push them in the right direction, you're doing the same thing with your legislators. You're just trying to get them to move a little bit in the right direction. And you're doing so by speaking their language as much as possible, and connecting with them on an interpersonal level. And the people who are the most effective advocates are the ones who establish a relationship with their elected official. And that's something that that any one of us can do, and certainly an area where social workers have skills. Another area that's a barrier is people not seeing the relevancy of their practice to to policy. And that is, we talked about that a little bit earlier at the beginning of the presentation. But again, that's really just about paying attention, because it is so interconnected. I mean, policy impacts everything we do. Maybe it's policy that's already set, but that's where we can come up with the ideas about how to change things to make a difference. And then finally, some stayed away from getting involved because they felt that politics was dirty or distasteful, which it can be from time to time. But we need to make sure that we're holding our elected officials accountable. And if we leave it only to the folks who who are engaging in bad behavior, then bad behavior is what will rule. Good people have to get involved too. There's also a few external barriers that social workers face. And if you are impacted by any of these, then get in touch with me following the presentation, because I have a lot more detail and information about this, but this is only a time to touch on it very briefly. One is the belief that nonprofit or public employees are not allowed to lobby. Or restrictions that by employers that say you're not allowed to lobby, and also or being involved in political campaigns. So again, I have a lot more information on this, but in general, what I will say is that you are you may be restricted on what behavior you do at work, but that's it, at work. On your personal time and using your own personal resources like your home email account and that sort of thing. Nobody has the right to restrict what you do as far as legislative advocacy. You may just have to separate and be clear about the fact when you're meeting with your elected officials that you're there representing yourself and not representing your agency. And that's true whether you work for the federal government, the state government, nonprofit organizations, or private practices. All works kind of the same way. So what can social workers do? How can we be involved? We can be involved in the political realm, which includes voting, volunteering for a candidate, which does not necessarily mean what you think it means. If you haven't ever volunteered before, they do give you options, or you can kind of create options. So if you're not willing to do cold calling of asking people for donations, then don't do it. Just but do something else and get involved. You can also get involved with your political action committee for state or local organization. NASW has PACE, which is our political action committee, and we have volunteer opportunities or donation opportunities available there. But I'm just touching on that, not trying to recruit you right now. And we can mobilize or educate others. We can try to change the election process to maybe cut down on gerrymandering or try to make things a little bit more fair. And social workers are great people to consider running for office. So, if you're interested at all in getting involved or running for office, well, you can count on PACE to support you for one thing. And also we know of tons of different trainings for, how to run for office. So if that's something you're interested in, again, connect with me at a different time after the presentation. Okay, at the policy level, there's lots of different ways to get involved, and that's one, we can talk about those a little bit more. Okay, sorry. I pushed a button and okay, there we go. All right, so one, of course, is just to stay as informed as possible, so that we can keep track of, what policy changes are in play, how they're going to impact us, how they're going to impact the clients we serve. So that way we're not caught by surprise. When we do have changes like that come up, we can advocate in a variety of different contexts through phone, emails, letters, and social media. We can testify at public or legislative hearings. And then we can do legislative visits as well. And I include all of that all the way up into, that you can be personally involved in writing bills and getting sponsors, kind of like I talked about earlier during that formulation process. It doesn't always, it can be, there's a bill that I know of that was passed because of like a competition among fourth graders about, what's the best idea, and they passed a great bill because of that. Other times it's just because, if you have that relationship with your elected official, you can just call them up and say, hey, what if we did this? And, and that's a good way to get started too. So lobbying, the first piece about, getting involved at the policy process level is, being comfortable with the term lobbying. It gets a dirty word or dirty connotation from how it's used in the media or during campaigns. And that really has to do with the people who are, who are using money or to influence. But lobbying is just any action that we take in order to influence decision making made by legislators or government officials. One thing that I use a lot when I'm talking to school groups, to students at, who may be going to lead, is that, if you as a student have ever asked your teacher to move a test date, or especially work together as a class to get them to change a test date or a deadline, then you're already familiar with lobbying. It's just a difference of where you're applying it. But lobbying is a First Amendment protected right. It says specifically, just like our freedom of press, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, we have the right to lobby. And that's addressed in the First Amendment, where it says Congress shall make no law abridging the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So it's definitely our right, which goes back into some of those external barriers too. It's, nobody has the ability to take away our right to, to contact our elected officials to try and make change. That's part of, our United States Constitution. So knowing that and kind of getting comfortable with the lobbying piece, what are the most effective ways to do it? You pretty much think of it as the more time it takes, the more effective it is, unfortunately. And then you can kind of use that to do your own thinking. How important is an issue to you? Is it important enough for you to get involved? Is it important enough for you to, make a phone call? Is it important enough for you to schedule a visit with your elected official? Well, the research that's on this slide that you see here was done from a study that asked a group of staff members at the congressional level, if your legislator has not already made a decision on a piece of legislation, how likely are the following things to make an impact on that legislator? And in-person constituent visits, so like meeting one-on-one with your legislator, is the single most effective thing. And that's true whether you're meeting with them in Harrisburg, like at Advocacy Day or some other event, or if you're meeting with them in the district. As a matter of fact, in the district can be, usually they're a lot less hectic, so you get more time with them. You get to talk with them about a bunch of other things. Kind of some of that, like, well, what's going on with you? What are the issues that impact you? And that constituent piece is important too. You can't just talk to any legislator. It needs to be your legislator. That's the area where you have the most ability to make a difference. Letters and emails are good as well, but if they are written by you, which is, a lot of times you'll get those letters where it's like, well, I don't know what to say, or, I want the talking points, or I want somebody to write the letter for me so that it's written well. Well, that's good, but if they get more than one of the same letter, then they know that it's a form letter, and then they start paying less attention to it. So what really makes a difference to the legislators and their staff is when they hear from you. How is it going to make a difference in your life? What are the stories that you know about, whether it's stories about how it's impacted you in the past, stories about how it's impacted your clients, how it's impacted your family, how it's impacted people you know, and then just your own kind of reasoning about why you think something is important. Of course, you can include talking points from other organizations, but if you care about an issue, then take the time to write your own letter or email. And that was listed at about 20% said it would have a lot of effectiveness, and another 70% said it would have at least some impact. Phone calls are important too. Phone calls were next highest on the list. Those are usually short and simple, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in just a second. And I put the visit from the lobbyist there because, I think if you weren't in that position directly, you might think, well, lobbyists, they have more power than I do. But that's not really true. If you're constituent, and you have more power than the lobbyist. The lobbyists, they said only 8% said that a visit from a lobbyist would have a lot of impact, and 74% said some. But compare that 8% to the 46% who said that a visit from you as a constituent would have a lot of impact. So as I said, we will talk a little bit more about the phone ones and some of the tips for the emails. We did already kind of talk about the mail and the letter. But for the phone, the important thing is volume. What they are doing is, they are basically going to keep a tally of how many calls did we receive for this bill, how many calls did we receive against this bill. So if you know that and you keep that in mind, one, you don't have to have a whole ton of information and talking points. You just basically need to call up and be like, hi, my name is Joanna Bird. I'm supporting House Bill 445. I encourage the senator to vote yes when this bill comes before the upcoming committee. So that's really all you need to know at that point. But if you can, if you're wanting to increase your effectiveness, see how many other people you can get to call. Do you have friends, family members, neighbors, people at your office, etc., that you can get to call? Because if you can help increase that tally sheet, then you're making a huge difference on behalf of your bill. So the importance, whenever you're thinking about phone calls advocacy, the importance is volume. With mail or email, like I said earlier, you want to keep your letters brief, but use examples and stories, and then back that up with supporting facts. With with any of these things, phone, mail, or in-person visits, the best practice is to just cover one issue at a time, unless you're talking to your elected official and they ask you about what else. But try to only go there for one thing at a time. And there are, because most people don't contact their elected officials, they kind of assume that you're representing probably at least another people who feel the same way but didn't bother to call. And I think that can be empowering too, to know that, that they kind of assume that you're there representing other people. So you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for at least like a group of 10. Some tips here are, again, like I mentioned earlier, you can visit with your legislator while they're in the district, and you have more time with them then. Especially when they're not busy, you can visit when you don't need something, and try to maybe offer your services. Like they get calls. Sometimes the legislator's office is like, they almost need case managers. Some of them even hire case managers because they get called with all sorts of things. So if you have resources you can offer, if you can be of any support to their constituents, then let them know that. And that's the sort of thing that helps build those relationships. If you're meeting with your elected official, this is the short acronym of what to do, and that is to remember your HAT. And the HAT stands for homework, ask, and thank you. The homework is to know as much, to try to learn about your legislator before you're meeting with them. Learn about their interests, learn about their biography. You may be able to find connections of things that you have in common with them that you can bring up that will help you establish rapport and build your relationship. Try to know the issues that are important to them, but at the same time, don't make assumptions. Not every conservative feels this way about everything. Not every liberal feels the same way about everything. A really good example I have is a legislator who we disagreed on almost everything, but when I had a bill connected to suicide prevention, anytime I had a bill connected to suicide prevention, we could count on them for their full support because they had a family member who had committed suicide, and so therefore that was an issue of passion for them. Try to know the vocabulary, like House Bill 445, prime sponsor, opposition, just speak in the same language they do, and know about the bill enough that that if they've already signed on a sponsor, that you're not asking them to just co-sponsor it or anything. And it's not a huge task. It's just like going to the webpage, reviewing their biography for a few minutes, and and then skimming over the bill and checking who the bill sponsors are. You're not, if you do it, you'll just be better prepared and more effective. The next step on the A is knowing what your ask is, having a specific question, so that you're not just giving them information. Are you asking them to co-sponsor it? Are you asking them to support you? Are you asking them to to request somebody else bring the bill forward? There's all kinds of things we can ask them. And if you are attending LEAD, we will give you the information on what the ask is at the training in the morning, because that can change at a moment's notice. And then the final thing is thank you. Legislators get a lot of criticism. They get a lot of people asking them for stuff, of course. They don't get a lot of thank yous. So thanking them for anything can help you stand out in their mind, and can help build that relationship. Part of it is just, of course, thank you for the meeting, but the other piece is, if you can't think of, if they have voted your way in the past, then thank them for that. It'll show that you did a little bit of research about them. And if you disagree with them on everything, you can still find something to thank them for. If nothing else, just thank them for their service, because being a legislator is a hard job, and they did it. We're wrapping up in these last couple of minutes. There's only like a couple of slides left. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and type them in. As soon as I get to these last couple of slides, we'll address them. But the last few points is, be prepared to be short, because sometimes, I've had legislative appointments that were scheduled to be like, okay, you can have between 153 and 156 with the legislator. So when you're only going to have 3 minutes, you got to keep your message short and to the point. But it's not always like that by any means. So we got to be prepared for both. One, can we convey our message quickly? The other is, can we provide examples? Can we talk a little bit about who we are as social workers, and why, help break down some of those stereotypes and myths? Can you talk about how a bill will impact you, so that you're connecting with your legislator and giving those stories about things that will make a difference to them? We do think about it as being professional, and so we want to be polite and friendly, not confrontational, even if it's somebody that that we disagree with what they're doing vehemently, we still want to make sure that, again, that we're addressing it from a professional level and treating it like you would a client who disagreed with you about the best method of process going forward. If you're asked a question you don't know the answer to, just say you don't know and jot down the question and the information, and the person who asked you, and then research that and get back to them afterwards. If you're working with NASW, or if you were attending LEAD, for example, then you would just get us the information and then we would get back with you. And then so you do want to be prepared for anything. Sometimes they try if you're working with them on a bill where you disagree with somebody, sometimes they'll try to say things to discourage you that aren't, in a nice way. But they'll do things like saying, well, that bill really isn't going anywhere, or I'm not sure that that's the best issue for us. And sometimes you can take those and take it personally, but in this case, it's really, be prepared that they could say anything. But you just gotta let that roll off your back and kind of do some jujitsu, or throw that back at them. Where if they say, oh, that bill's not going anywhere, then be like, well, that's why I thought it was really important that that I wanted to meet with you to educate you about why the bill is so important, and that I hope you will help make it move. So we're ready for stuff like that, but also don't underestimate yourself or your impact. You may not always see the changes you make, but I've known legislators who went from opposing a bill to co-sponsoring a bill based on just one visit from an elected official. And and certainly it's the kind of thing where it stacks up. So you may not be the one who pulls the lever, but if you pushed them in the right direction, then you still made a huge difference. It's not working in legislation and advocacy is not always about the big victories. It's many times about the small steps. And that's why this final quote from Martin Luther King is very appropriate. And that is, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. And with that, we have a couple of minutes left. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to address them. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, then thank you very much for your participation. I hope that you enjoyed the webinar.
And we will be in touch with everybody as well in order to get you your continuing education certificates. Looks like we do have one question. Oh, okay. Just a couple thank yous. So, well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, and like I said, we'll be in touch to follow up and get your continuing education to you. So thank you guys for joining.